Popcap are probably best known for a string of browser and mobile games that helped define their respective genres. Titles like Alchemy, Bejeweled, and Peggle were important in popularising a more casual, yet still deep, approach to gaming. Among their most successful series is Plants vs Zombies, which has spawned several spin-offs and sequels since it first released in 2009. It was also one of the games that established Laura Shigihara as a formidable musical talent. Without her soundtrack, Plants vs Zombies would lose much of its memorable character, which Laura magnified with a playful and vibrant palette of sounds. She provided such accomplished work to the game that Peter McConnell, who took over composing duties from PVZ2, has kept it firmly in mind for every sequel since. Because of that, the series has carved out its own distinctive feel, and one that expertly matches the cartoonish fun on screen. I'm Lee Tyrrell, and this is the Sound Test, where I look in depth into video game audio and music, along with the very people who crafted it. This week, following on from her first short appearance in this series' Minecraft episode, Laura Shigihara returns to the show for her first of two lengthier conversations. Additionally, Peter McConnell makes his Sound Test debut ahead of an expansive LucasArts podcast in 2020. In this Plants vs Zombies special, the three of us explore what makes the franchise's music stick out and fit so well with the madcap world around it. To begin, Laura was a keen fan of VGM from childhood. Much of Laura's music shows a deep love for the tradition and language of game audio, and it's something that seems to come naturally to her after years of genuine passion and familiarity. So, considering her reverence for the history of VGM, what were some of the key titles that influenced her over the years?
I've liked video game music, I think, since the Mega Man days. I think that was the first game where I really, the first series where I really paid attention to the music in video games. And I think that influenced me quite a lot because I really enjoyed listening to all the different layers in the music. I took piano lessons. I was classically trained on the piano, and I remember noticing that there were a lot of similarities between classical music and the music in some of the original Mega Man games. I was like, oh, look, there's counterpoint melody here, and there's circle of fifths going on, and oh, the bass line in this has its own melody, and it's really interesting what it's doing with the other parts of the arrangement. And I think when I tried to tell my piano teacher this, they thought I was crazy because they're just like, it just sounds like beeps to me, But I think from those days, I started noticing these concepts that I really liked about music. The idea of having a really kind of catchy, simple enough melody that you could hum it later and you could remember it, but an arrangement that was complex enough that you'd be able to hear it on loop over and over again as you played without it becoming irritating to the player. So that's definitely something that influenced me a lot. Beyond that, I also really liked music in RPGs like Chrono Trigger, the Final Fantasy series. I liked how it was very, evocative it really helped you feel what was going on, because back in those days, like Super Nintendo games, it was 2D pixel graphics, and the dialogue, I think, was kind of limited how much they could write. So I really feel like music played a big role in helping the player feel immersed. So yeah, I guess there's a lot of stuff throughout video game music history that has inspired me or influenced me.
Though I often label video game music as its own genre, in terms of style, VGM can go just about anywhere. It's one of the reasons that I find so much joy in it, and that diversity shows up repeatedly in Laura's writing. Plants vs. Zombies has a definite sound, but it still manages to incorporate a variety of feels and instruments as you play. Mixing genres is a cornerstone of composing for games, and one that keeps PVZ alive from beginning to end. It's a large part of the series' humour too, which is highlighted by some of the unexpected mashups that bubble through the score.
The mixing of genres, I think, that happens a lot in video game music was something that influenced me, because a lot of the music I listened to on the radio kind of stuck primarily to whatever genre they fell into. Like hip hop was hip hop, and rock was rock, and alternative was alternative. But in video game music, it seemed like they mixed some really interesting genres together. You had like gothic classical with metal, and you had like hip hop with like Baroque music, and there was just like a whole bunch of weird things kind of melding together. And I was like, oh, that's really cool that you can do that. And yeah, being a classical pianist as well, it's really fun to get to incorporate all these different kind of things in, everything from, I listened to a pretty wide variety of music growing up. I think most of my friends would, they'd usually say I like all music except country and rap. And I'm like, well, I think I like something from like pretty much every genre, like every type of music. My radio stations, my presets are so varied. And if I would ever make like a mix CD or something like that, it was so eclectic. It would be like, here's some video game music, and then here's some electronic stuff, then here's like classical, then hip hop, then metal, then, I like some progressive rock as well. I mean, it's very varied, and I think that helps when it comes to writing game music, because a lot of times you need to do some strange stuff to fit the gameplay. So I think that helps a lot.
Because VGM never shies away from exploring various musical styles, depending on the project, it can actually be educational. Most kids and teenagers play some kind of video game, and they almost always feature an original soundtrack. Thanks to the wide range of titles on the market, that means players are just as likely to encounter something classical as they are jazzy, or run into hard rock rubbing shoulders with ambient synthscapes. To add to that, most VGM is incredibly accomplished. As gamers, even in our youth, we notice the hard work and inspiration in a good OST, which is probably why you're listening to this podcast in the first place.
These days, it seems a lot more people are becoming interested in video game music. Like, I get a lot of requests for sheet music. Somebody wrote me a while ago asking for the sheet music and made the comment about, they're like, oh, I noticed you use circle of fifths in in Loonboon, and that's cool because I'm learning about that in my piano lessons and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, that's cool that they pick up on that. One of the reasons I think that I like video game music is that I feel it's accessible, but still also complex. Obviously, there's classical music that has very relatable melodies, but sometimes the whole thing can be very, very complex and the kind of thing where you have to kind of acquire it after listening to it for a while. And then on the other, end of the spectrum, you have, pop music and top 40 music on the radio where the melodies are very, very super catchy and they're designed that way to be like earworms. But a lot of times I feel those tracks get played out really quickly and you can get sick of it very fast. And I thought one day, I'm like, oh, why is it that some songs or some pieces of music have more longevity than others? And I feel like there's this happy medium that you can achieve with classic or with video game music where you can have the kind of catchy, relatable melodies. But at the same time, you can do really interesting things with the arrangement that'll have a lot of roots in like classical music or jazz, and mixing those things together, I think does allow people to kind of learn about those things.
Obviously, games don't use a toy box of different sounds in their music for the sake of it. Usually, style is determined in part by the on-screen action, with the title's themes and feeling informing the rest. We get such a range of genres in VGM, partly from the sheer number of unique personalities in the industry. But it's also because the games themselves demand it. Sometimes, like with Plants vs Zombies, it might not be immediately clear what direction to go in. We all know what to expect from certain releases, like high-octane electronica for racing sims. But what struck Laura as the right way to score a tower defense game starring the undead and their relentless assault on flowers?
I just wanted to do something that felt really funny. Because I think, let's see, it's been a long time, but the example I usually give is there are some sections in Plants vs. Zombies that just get so ridiculous. Like you'll be playing and you don't even realize how ridiculous it's getting because you're just like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to plant the sunflower. Okay, oh, and now I need to freeze the zombies and oh, I need to put up a walnut. And then you just, sit back for a second and go, oh, I'm planting really ridiculous things. Yeah, these zombies are really ridiculous. And it's like suddenly you have this like bobsled team like of zombies like sliding down your lawn, and it's just normal, but it's super, crazy. And I'm like, well, I need to compose something that kind of fits how ridiculous it can get. And for some reason, like big swing beats and, those sorts of things, it just sounds chaotic, like a lot of stuff's going on. And so I think jazz is like that too, where it can sound really chaotic, but in a good way. And I think that was probably the reason I incorporated those themes.
Choosing the right mood for the music, and even individual levels, is only the first step. Next comes the actual writing process for melodies, chord sequences, rhythms, and everything that goes into a fully fledged composition. Although all musicians use essentially the same tools in their art, it can be remarkable how approaches vary. Acclaimed C64 composer, Ben Daglish, often sang his melodies as he wrote them, while Ridiculon, who appeared with Laura on certain ports of Super Meat Boy, tend to jam out as a duo. Since Plants vs Zombies is an enormously complex and layered work when it comes to musicality, how does Laura achieve that?
I'm not so great at technical, like musical theory, like how I think about it that way. I think a lot of times I think about it in like, oh, this makes me feel this way, or this chord progression makes me feel this way. But in retrospect, if I am to break it down, what I usually do is I'll play the game through and I'll try to see if it conjures up any melodies in me, or any feelings. And then I kind of try to put that to the sheet music. So I think having an overriding melody is very important, and what you do with that melody really influences how the player feels. Like you could have a melody that's in a minor key with, and you can go to a certain direction with that makes the player feel sad. But then you can put a lot of like half steps in, and have kind of stuff where you mix that with like really kind of energetic beats of some sort. And for some reason, the combination of that together seems to be able to fit humorous situations. And it's kind of tough to explain. I think when it comes to instrumentation, half the time I'll start by already knowing which instruments I want to use. And, I'll go into it like, oh, I think this is going to be a primarily piano and strings driven piece, and half the time I'll go into it kind of just building iteratively and kind of experimenting.
Primarily, Laura is a piano player, and though piano shows up many times in-game, PvZ's soundtrack offers a long list of other instruments too. The only way to gain a working understanding of the appropriate use of varied instrumentation is through experience and experiments. Like the actual composition, everyone does it in their own way. It's also profoundly affected by the equipment and budget available. So, over 10 years before the recording of this podcast, when Laura first started with Plants vs Zombies, she used some interesting techniques when choosing her sounds.
A lot of times I actually start out with something that I've called before. I call it like the MIDI test, which I like doing, which a lot of times before I would actually start off composing with really, really basic instruments. I actually don't do this anymore because I sort of know all my sound banks better and stuff like that. But in the beginning, I would start off by composing with just the original 128 MIDI sound bank. And those instruments can sound pretty cheesy. And I sort of feel like if I can make something that sounds like I'd want to listen to it using just those sounds, then it's like a really good base for me because I know the the arrangement will be solid and the composition will be solid. And so I usually start with that. And then from there, I'll kind of figure out, what am I going for here? Is it something I want to sound more electronic? Is it something I want to sound, I want it to sound more orchestral, or more jazzy, and I'll kind of pick instruments based on that. At that point too, it's a lot of iteration, where I'll test out different sounds and see how they work together. Other times I work in the other direction where it's like, I know from the get-go I want this to be a piano piece that has just like a gentle sine wave for ornaments in the background. And so I'll start building that way. I'll play on the piano first and I'll be like, oh, okay, I've got this melody down. I'm gonna note this on, in the sheet music, and then I'll just kind of start layering from there. I'll start by having another melody to complement the piano. And then I'll be like, well, now I need to fill in the chords a bit, and maybe I'll choose, if I want it to sound kind of more like a video game style, more electronic, maybe I'll choose like a square wave, and I sort of just build on that way. And I find that that process is really fun because it's just neat to see how different instruments interact.
It's especially impressive when composers like Laura write comfortably for instruments they don't physically play. Anyone who listened to most of the sound tests previous season will know about my obsession with the bass guitar, in no small part because it's my own instrument of choice. As I've brought it up, you can make a good guess at the quality of bass in Plants vs Zombies. How exactly does Laura go about constructing her bass lines, and indeed, parts for anything else outside of piano?
I think for some instruments, I will go read about it or talk to my friends who play those instruments to make sure that, like for example, with like flutes or like wind instruments, I ask, what's the range? Because I don't want to. So if I'm going for something that's more realistic, I want to make sure that I'm actually at least in the proper range, or doing something that sounds accurate. But other times, it's largely a feel thing. I think, like what you said, of listening to music and noticing what I like in tracks. Like I always liked when the bass did stuff because it would make me feel really excited. I think like just the ability to feel it in your heart when the bass is strong. And I'd always notice as a kid that I'd get all pumped up when I'd hear a track where the bass was kind of like, it sounded like it was running and it would do something really cool with the syncopation. And so I think it's largely a feel thing, based on listening to a lot of music. Putting in that bass line is so fun because sometimes I'll hear music where the bass is pretty simple. It's just, like whole notes or quarter notes, but I love to have the bass have its own melody and kind of interact with the other parts of the arrangement. I think that the bass, it just makes your heart go, you know what I mean? So I love being able to, when I get to lay the bass down, I'll try to do some interesting interactions with the bass melody, kind of talking with the other instruments, so to speak, and then change it up. And I have a lot of fun with that.
Generally, rhythmic and percussive instruments call for a totally separate mindset. Drums, partnered with bass, arguably drive compositions and their overall tone more than anything else, and there's a lot of rhythm in PVZ. Many of Laura's beats for the game are cleverly emergent too, slowly building to full prominence as a level goes on. The sounds themselves mix MIDI and samples with an array of unique recordings, like the noise of a can of tennis balls popping open. Again, as a pianist first and foremost, does Laura have any underlying philosophies for writing her rhythms and beats?
One thing I really liked about the music from Mega Man, for example, is when I was a kid, there were certain tracks that would come on, or when the beat would drop, when it would feel really cool or exciting. And I loved that feeling, because combined with when you were, running through the stage and shooting things and jumping, you'd feel very strong or very powerful. And I was like, oh, I want to invoke that cool feeling, or, stuff like that. So when I composed Brainiac Maniac, that's the one you hear when you fight the final boss. I really wanted it to feel that cool feeling, and I think for that, I would think about the percussion, it's got to be moving, it's got to be energetic. And like right when the beat drops like that's like a very important part. So I would usually just think about the feel and then go from there. The way I do my rhythm stuff, as I've learned, is actually kind of strange compared to how most people do stuff. Like I don't think I ever use loops on things. I don't even use like a percussion track in the sheet music. What I compose everything all as if it were piano. Like basically every track is like on the sheet music, and it's all stacked up. And so I usually organize it like the instruments that are kind of in the upper register are up at the top. So I'll have sine wave and piano and little ornaments that I put in like bells or things like that kind of towards the top. And then I'll have bass and percussion at the bottom. And for percussion, I just have it like a bass and a treble track, and I have a different instrument assigned to each key. So for example, C#5 might be like a hi-hat, and D2 might be a bass drum. And so that way, when you see it, it actually just looks like sheet music. Sometimes I have sounds that come from libraries. Sometimes I would make my own sounds. I think for Plants vs. Zombies, I recorded a lot of sounds and then patched them to the individual notes. Let's see, like I know, for example, some of the sound effects are like footstep noises. I think there's something that was, let's see, like in the Crazy Dave intro theme, part of the percussion comes from tennis ball can opening, like cracking the tennis ball can opening. It's this like quick sound that I used for it. So there's like a lot of like weird stuff in there.
Games of the 21st century often offer a remarkable creative playground for someone who's up to the challenge. That's precisely why Laura was able to incorporate some more left-field percussive sounds into her palette. And a similar flair shows up time and time again in the art of Foley, for example. As audio has been increasingly accepted as the gigantic asset it is, professionals in the field have found themselves involved with projects earlier and earlier in their development. Laura was on board with Plants vs. Zombies across its conception, meaning some of her music was written nearer the end of production, when she was better acquainted with how the game itself worked.
I feel that writing music at the end of the soundtrack, you've already established kind of what the soundtrack is about, like, and it feels very cohesive, and you can do stuff like load up all the music on a playlist, listen to it together, and sort of be like, okay, I know what this is about. I know what, like kind of the big picture is at that point. So I feel like it was easier and more fun to write the later music because I felt like I had more of a handle on things. And also, you kind of, I think by that point you get to see more of the game. Like a lot of the times when I come onto a project, it's more towards the end of the life cycle of the game. But for this one, I was there from the very beginning. And so I was kind of writing tracks like as the levels were being created. And I already knew how everything was going to resolve. And I think just mentally that really helped process how I wanted it to feel.
Potentially the game's best known track, played over the end credits, is Zombies on Your Lawn, which was itself completed nearer the end of PVZ's development. It's a cutely comedic, upbeat pop tune about, unsurprisingly, a zombie insurgence, sung from the perspective of a concerned sunflower. The idea came from Laura's inspiration rather than any brief, and absolutely encapsulates the whole tone of the title. Even the fun in its recording process is audible, especially through the manic, reanimated growls of George Fan and Laura's own father in a specific Japanese version.
I was so excited just to be able to do a vocal track in a game, because I think at that point there hadn't been that many vocal tracks. I think Portal, Still Alive, had come out at that point, and there was, a lot of Japanese games like Final Fantasy games that had lyrical tracks, but there wasn't like a whole lot at that point. And I was like, I really do this because I feel like something I very much enjoy doing is songwriting. And so I think I was just like, let's do something funny. I really wanted something funny. They didn't actually ask me to make a lyrical track. It was just something I wanted to do as kind of like this personal thing if I finished the rest of the arrangement, or the rest of the arrangements for the soundtrack. And I think I remember too at the time being a bit like, at first I was really confident about it, but I got a little insecure at some point because I listened to this Jonathan Coulton song that came out around that time. I think it was called R.E. Your Brains. And I was like, oh no, this song is so good and it's so funny and catchy and it's about zombies. And I'm like, how can I write something this funny? And so for like about a week, I was like, I don't know if I can, continue with this song. Mine's not going to be as good. But then I was just like, okay, I need to not compare to other stuff and just do my own style. And it ended up coming together really well, and I was really happy about that. And then I think later, like, Jonathan Coulton had heard the Plants vs. Zombies song, and he said that he liked it, and I was like, oh yay.
So it doesn't matter. Instead, we'll use the solar power to make a lawn defense at any hour.
When we were putting it all together, it was fun working with both George and with my dad for that, because I remember getting all the mic stuff set up, and especially with my dad, he was so funny because he has a very loud voice sometimes. So like often when he was doing the zombie vocals, like it would clip, and I'd be like, okay, Dad, that was great, but can you take it down just a little bit or back up from the mic just a little bit? And we wanted him to do something different too, because I think for George's part, he sounded like, like the classic zombies. And we thought it would be really funny if my dad sounded like the kind of stereotypical overzealous Japanese game show host. And so we had him do this really kind of weird, like overzealous, really emphatic zombie. And whenever I hear it, I can't stop laughing. It was fun to pull him onto that project.
脳みそを食べるぞ俺たちゾンビだ
ゾンビがやってきたゾンビがやってきたゾンビがやってきたゾンビは出ていた
The character, joy, and musicality that Laura brought to Plants vs. Zombies was invaluable. Though she did provide some material to PVZ2, which released 4 years after the original, Popcap called in Peter McConnell to write the majority of the score. Peter is celebrated for his output with LucasArts in the 90s, and that still only skims an even wider career. But when he joined the PVZ team, keeping Laura's melodic spirit alive was prominent in his mind.
I got a call from the Popcap people in 2013 that they needed help with a couple of the episodes for PVZ2. It was pretty much that quick, I guess, because they knew my stuff and they knew me. And of course I knew all about Plants vs. Zombies because Laura's work is so epic and singular and seminal. So it was really cool to be able to be involved. And the first thing I really did was to try to preserve that sound as much as I could. to really preserve her vision, which I've always tried to, in all the various incarnations of PVZ that I've worked on. I've always tried to keep a little of her in there because I just have so much respect for her.
Peter is certainly no slouch when it comes to adapting his composition for different projects. His most popular soundtracks include games like Grim Fandango, Monkey Island, Sly Cooper, and Psychonauts, all featuring their own influences and overall style. Most appropriately, considering his work with Laura's themes, he was regularly given the task of scoring Star Wars titles, allowing for ample practice with reimagining existing pieces. What stuck out as essential elements in PVZ's music, and how did he go about making them his own?
I spent years at LucasArts doing John Williams melodies, right, for various LucasArts games, and it's to me a wonderful challenge to really get inside another artist's head to the degree that you can, and experience the details of what they're all about, what that particular piece that they've done is all about, to the best of your ability. Obviously, you can't get inside someone's head completely, and all musicians are different, all people are different, but it's a wonderful learning experience to try to do that, to try to be faithful to someone else's vision. It's just, it's a different. It's not like better or worse than writing your own stuff. It's just a different experience, and one that's, I find, really very satisfying because anytime you're creating music, you have certain things that certain variables you're going to hold fixed. You have certain ground rules that you're going to lay for yourself. I mean, Stravinsky used to, he would write a piece and just consciously reduce the note choice to certain notes, just as a guardrail, just as a way of giving structure to the piece. So when you're working with someone else's material, what's fixed is their themes. So you're learning from them, and you're trying to do something that's in harmony with what they intended, as best as you can determine it. And I find that to be incredibly expansive, an experience that helps you grow as a musician. That sound, that PVZ sound, is it's grounded in K-pop, but also in this kind of, I don't know what Laura's listened to, but she's obviously a deep thinking musician, and has a lot of influences. And what I hear is some of this sort of, for want of a better word, cabaret-ish or Kurt Weill-ish kind of dark 20th century European thing that is just a touch of it that keeps the balance between that and the more brightness of the K-pop sound. That's just my sort of really amateur analysis of that sound, and she might be thinking of it a completely different way. I have no idea.
When analysing the actual compositional makeup of PVZ's music across the series, one important thing repeatedly shows up. Pretty much all of the music in all of the games is written in a minor key, which is widely accepted as having a sadder sound than its major counterparts. Funnily enough, both Laura and Peter are still able to make their themes sound peppy and upbeat, while retaining a gloomy edge that plays into the B-movie horror influence found throughout the franchise. It proves that minor melodies aren't always depressing, and can actually be perceived in a number of ways.
Happy minor is well, it's one of my favorite things. I did a lot of Happy Minor and Grim Fandango. With something like Plants vs. Zombies, you have a very whimsical world with these lo-fi synth sounds that are kind of simple sounding and bright sounding, and you need something to balance that a little bit. So that's why you do it in a minor key. It's kind of hard to describe, honestly. I know what I'm I know what I'm doing when I'm doing it, but when you talk about it later, it's sort of like it's hard to put into words. But minor is it's something that, you know, after all, it is about zombies, you know, and and shooting them. So there needs to be this sort of there's a touch of cabaret almost a little bit. You know how cabaret music from the 30s and the 20s has this haunting feeling to it, because it's party music, but it's often kind of sad sounding at the same time. That'd be sort of, that's not a direct analogy, but it's an analogy.
While we're on the subject of minor key in the Plants vs. Zombies series, let's take a deeper look at some of the music theory that makes it work. It's relatively common knowledge that most songs are written in either a major or minor key, which are both then associated with their own feelings. Within each, chords or phrases can be played that are either consonant or dissonant. Consonance refers to notes that sound particularly pleasing and harmonic, while dissonance is considered harsh. The most dissonant note in the vast majority of scales, be it a traditional major or minor, is the tritone, also known as the flattened fifth, the augmented fourth, or most colourfully, the devil's interval. Although it was once taboo to employ, and dreaded by singers for its difficulty, it's become more and more central to popular music. In Plants vs. Zombies, it's essential to maintaining the terror of a minor scale, but with a bounce that keeps it from taking itself too seriously.
The tritone is, yeah, it's the devil's interval, as you said. You know, if my people used to get in pretty hefty trouble back in the Middle Ages for employing it incorrectly, you might expect to get a letter from the bishop if you were a court composer or a church composer and you used that interval in a way that was considered ill-mannered. And the reason for that is it is the hardest interval to sing, and so from that sort of, now dissonance and consonance are sort of there, if you don't mind my getting too musically geeky here. They are slightly relative terms, that a consonance in one piece can be a dissonance in another, but by and large, overall, there are some tones, some intervals, and some chords that just tend to naturally sound harsh or dissonant or dark or haunting. For all the cultural connections that those tones have, if not some sort of biological connection. There's all kinds of fun dorm room debate that can be had about that. But but the long story short, the tritone is really one of the most interesting intervals in music. So I try to reach for one whenever I can, and that was something in some of Laura's original themes where she used the tritone in a way that was I can't right off the top of my head come up with an example, but I know they're in there, and it's the sound of something being a little dark, a little off, a little and it can be something that just happens in passing and then it resolves itself. Or if you start to stack them or move them one after the other, you will get, more of a dark sound. And, one of the really sort of iconic examples of that would be the opening to Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze. So you got the low tritone and the high tritone, bum, 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 bum. That's a really harsh sound. And, he did that on purpose. He knew that the tritone was that was the jazz. It was the language of jazz. So much of you, because you can suggest all these chord structures with just two notes. Those two dissonant notes. You're picking the most essentially dissonant notes out of the chord, and then you're moving those two notes around. And that's kind of a jazz thing. And of course, the big question when you're writing this music is it a flat 5 or is it a sharp 4? And you're playing with that all the time. Does the interval want to spread out or does it want to shrink? Does it want to go up or down? That tritone note. In terms of Plants vs. Zombies, that kind of thing. Using those certain kind of dissonances like the tritone and the minor second and so on, that's just something you kind of do unconsciously, and it gives you the vibe that you're going for. You just kind of, it's like speaking a language. You don't necessarily go, well, now I'm going to employ a sentence that has a noun, a subject, and a predicate, and has a prepositional phrase at the end. When you're writing music, it's the same way. You just come up with a melody, and then afterwards you might go, oh yeah, I really like that part of the melody because it hits the tritone or whatever. So there's kind of a conscious part and an unconscious part when you're doing that.
As heard in Laura's section of this podcast, there's significantly more to PVZ's music than its melodic makeup. Peter latched on to aspects like tritones and the use of minor key, but he paid just as close attention to the original's instrumentation. He didn't stop there either, because in order to stay truly authentic to the spirit of Laura's soundtrack, it also matters what kind of recordings are used. To make my point with extremes, there's a vast difference between a violin recorded at Abbey Road and rudimentary MIDI-controlled samples from 90s keyboards. With a range of possibilities available to him, what did Peter choose as the best fit for Laura's established palette?
Well, one thing that I did, and this was, I was working with Guy Whitmore at the time, who was kind of spearheading that. Guy Whitmore and Becky Allen, and later on Damien Kaspauer were all part of the team there on PVZ2. And I remember at one point, I'd sent a few cues to Guy, and he was like, yeah, this sounds good and everything like that. These are nice melodies, and they have the right mood, and but I was listening to him going, you know what? And I'd listen to Laura's stuff, and I would go, there's something missing about what I'm doing here, and what it is that my samples are too good. By being these sort of attempts to be real, they were losing the charm of the original sounds, of the original PVZ sounds, which by nature of their kind of lo-fi quality had a lightness and a sort of a tongue-in-cheek quality, like a little bit of a sense of humor that I was completely missing. So I actually went through a whole like couple levels of stuff I'd submitted and redid it with worse sounds, so that they would be charming again. And so I really took great care to find not use the Spitfire library recorded at Abbey Road and so on. To get that wonderful bass clarinet or that perfect French horn, it was like no. Let's actually go back to let's find some old sample sounds you haven't used in years, and let's use those because it's more appropriate. You don't want your music to try to be something that it isn't. Sometimes sounding like a real live player is what you want. Usually in that case, you want to then go ahead and replace it with a real live player, right? Because that's where you get all the expression, that's where you get all the subtlety, that's where you get all the emotion. But there are situations where you're like, okay, well, we're going to mock up real live players and we're just going to make it as hi-fi and punchy sounding as possible. That's, it's part of doing music for picture with a limited budget. And those situations, you just want to be very careful that if you're trying to imitate something else, go ahead for the imitation. If you're not, if you're trying to have a sound for its own sake, make sure it's the right sound. I hope that makes sense. What it translated into for PVZ was sometimes a smaller, less serious sounding sound is better for the piece and better for the feel and better for this little tiny charming game where you got these little dudes walking across the street and you're shooting peas at them. It's not something to go out and try to imitate Hans Zimmer, right? Maybe as an Easter egg on a lark, you might do something like that. But anyway, it might be kind of funny actually. But the point is, you're conscious about your choices. And in submitting my first round of stuff for PVZ2, I was just trying to sound good, quote good unquote, and that was wrong. What was right was to try to sound charming and light and punchy, and so that's what I went for. And sometimes I think I succeeded, and sometimes maybe not. But that was the mood I was going for.
To me, Peter was definitely successful, and then some, with his efforts. That's surely why he was called back for the Garden Warfare games, including the recent Battle for Neighbourville. His abilities were likely never in doubt anyway, as his previous association with LucasArts alone makes for an impressive resume. Indeed, He took a key role in the creation of iMuse, an extremely influential system for presenting dynamic music. Therefore, he had years of hands-on experience with the production process of games, and was usually in on a title from the beginning. In PVZ2's case, long after his tenure at LucasArts, how closely did he work with the team, and was there much chance to play it during development?
When you're doing music for a game and you're not in-house, there are limitations on what they can provide for you, what the team can provide for you in terms of first of all, they're building the game, right? So a lot of times it's much more efficient just to send you a QuickTime movie of gameplay, right? So and you can get a really good sense of it, but it's a QuickTime movie. You're not actually playing the game, and you're not actually hearing it on the little speakers. Now, in the case of PVZ2, especially for the first, 2 or 3 installations of it, there was a great deal of care, and it goes back to this point I was making about of having the appropriate sound. There was a great deal of care taken to make sure that I was in touch with the actual game experience. So they would send me an iPad that was loaded up with the game, and that would be my sort of workshop where I would be able to hear what I did and experience the levels.
Once Peter had spent all that time getting into the groove of PVZ2 and its tower defense gameplay, Garden Warfare came along in 2014 and turned it all on its head. Barely any core mechanics from the series as the fans knew it survived the transition, with the release instead styled as a largely multiplayer third-person shooter. Its positive reception led to a Garden Warfare sequel a couple of years later, and the similarly styled Battle for Neighborville just a few weeks before the recording of this podcast. By these games, Popcap and EA had moved so far into new territory that a complete musical overhaul would be, to an extent, understandable. But thankfully, the essence of Laura Shigihara's theme still drifts through Garden Warfare, mixing together with plenty of Peter's unique embellishments.
We really went through a period of finding our footing with Garden Warfare, because it is such a different experience to have a 3D semi-realistic plant and a 3D semi-realistic zombie than it is to have these really intentional 2D characters going across a plane, right? And we went through really a number of different styles to try to capture, well, we want to capture, it's got to sound fun. We can't use those same sort of smaller sounding samples that we used for the PVZ2 music because that wouldn't be appropriate for a big console that's got, that can push a lot of volume out of the speakers. Part of, I think, of the charm of Garden Warfare is that it's larger than life, but still not serious, right? It's the larger than lifeness of Garden Warfare that makes it fun. Like doing a battle with a giant tree, things are intentionally exaggerated in terms of scope, and so the music has to follow that without necessarily being like a full orchestral score, because that somehow loses the flavor of PVZ. So there were a fair amount of iterations that we went through where we just did the theme in different styles. We did like lounge music, believe it or not. We did, and that actually ended up making its way into the game and some of the leaderboard stuff. And we did like an A-Team version, and more of a sort of a gothy sort of 80s sound. But we kind of basically, it ended up being just a larger kind of synth pop, and a sort of a 80s synth pop, maybe with a bit more of with a little bit of a military twinge to it, since you're on a team right now. So a lot of snare drums.
Despite their regular use of existing themes, the Garden Warfare games definitely found their own tone. In general, they upped the tempo, added an extra sparkle to the production, and exaggerated selected instruments to suit the mood. They even expanded on the undead vocals that Laura introduced in her fan favourite, Zombies on Your Lawn. In fact, Peter assembled an entire zombie choir, or rather, simulated one with his own talents, a few Popcap employees, and a couple of lucky family members, echoing the use of Laura's dad back in 2009.
Yeah, the zombie choir became quite, especially with Garden Warfare 1 and 2, that really became a thing. And there were different versions of it. The simplest version was just me doing a bunch of voices. I do a lot of, vocal stuff. So like all the things that sound like female voices and the lounge music, that's all me. And the zombie choir in its simplest form was me, but I would also bring in my kids. Hopefully that's okay to say that, but they enjoyed being little zombies. And then some of the really full-blown zombie choir things, what we would do is I would do me and the kids, and then I would send it to Popcap in Vancouver, and then they would get everybody in the office together and sing along. So you get an entire, amateur, actually probably some of them were professionals, but you get an entire amateur choir going, and it's much more convincing that way.
That creativity and playful humour essentially sums up the Plants vs Zombies series, which is still growing as I record this. PvZ3 is in early access, directly continuing the main series after multiple successful spin-offs. Garden Warfare is a force of its own, while Heroes offers a collectible card game twist for mobile players. The music and sound of Heroes was handled by Becky Allen, who also worked on other Popcap titles like Peggle 2, and even alongside Peter on Plants vs Zombies 2. PvZ's many releases are enormously popular and devilishly entertaining, so it's only natural that their music has caught on. Laura's original themes, now available on her Bandcamp, have had enough time to sink in as VGM classics, especially through their repeated use in the whole series. Peter McConnell's respect for Laura's melodies and style has given a sometimes unpredictable franchise cohesion, but he went well beyond consistency. His own music expanded the world he wrote for, without ever treading on the undead toes of the original. However, Peter was already a legend of VGM for his years of fruitful toil. Laura Shigihara, now a game designer as well as a musician, established herself as an incredible talent with the project. Her compositions are as layered as they are perfect for the game itself. Amusing and colourful, but challenging and varied.
Every now and then, we'd get like a message like, oh, this national orchestra in China played Plants vs. Zombies, and that always blows my mind because I'm just like, I remember a time when video games were only being played by kids, and even then I think there weren't that many kids who played games past a certain point. So to be at a point where so many people are playing video games like all over the world, it's really, really kind of neat. I think it's also fun to see, just like the wide reach is really cool. Like thinking people in all these different countries can appreciate the style of music and stuff is very, very humbling and very cool.
I always enjoyed working with Laura's stuff. I can't say enough good stuff about it. It's elemental. There's a reason that it got so much notice when it came out. I'm particularly a melody guy, and I just really like her melodies. I think they're very catchy. Doesn't really do it justice. To write a really sort of iconic, polished melody that at the same time has a lightness and a sort of purity to it. It's a real feat to accomplish that, and she's really done it over and over again. So it was just really great to be able to work with that material.
Thanks to Laura and Peter for speaking to me for the sound test, but thank you too for taking the time to listen. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please make sure to follow or subscribe on whatever platform you might be listening on. This first mini run of ST2 will soon be taking a short break for Christmas, before returning in 2020 with the rest of the series. However, a new live broadcast of VGM Radio can be found on my channel every Friday evening. Next week, Christopher Larkin smashes his first sound test appearance with his insight and background on Hollow Knight, ahead of his second episode in 2020, covering his work on indie titles. All my Patreon supporters gain early access to that episode, no matter how much they pledge. So head on over to patreon.com/_secret cave to offer your support. Although this series will be taking a Christmas break, stay tuned in the new year for over 15 more documentary episodes before the series comes to an end. In the meantime, I hope you're enjoying this first taste of ST2.